Hi, my name is Jeff Miliff. I'm a Principal Program Manager with Office 365, and I'm here today to talk about running Exchange Hybrid over the long term. So to start off, let's talk about why hybrid, why an Exchange Hybrid deployment makes sense, why this actually matters, and why you should care. So what is hybrid Exchange? When we think about the term hybrid, it typically means the combination of on-premises systems and cloud systems, and that's exactly what we're talking about in this case. And there's really two different flavors of Exchange Hybrid. There's the concept of full hybrid and minimal hybrid. In both cases, what we're referring to is an Exchange organization that has had the hybrid configuration wizard run to configure one of these options. In the full hybrid case, that's really what we have considered sort of the traditional hybrid deployment, where you actually have full coexistence between your Office 365 organization and your on-premises organization, allowing users to communicate and collaborate seamlessly between the two. It really just appears to be one Exchange organization, and the users probably don't even know where their mailbox exists. Could be in either location, could move between the two for whatever reason, and the user wouldn't ideally be aware of that move at all. Minimal hybrid is a relatively new sort of flavor of hybrid Exchange that was developed to simplify the configuration process and make it possible to facilitate migration without adding in additional complexity that's not needed for customers that plan to maintain that long-term coexistence. And so really that minimal hybrid option is used to configure a solution that allows easy onboarding of mailboxes, regardless of the size of the organization, with the idea that once those mailboxes are migrated to Office 365 and Exchange Online, that the hybrid configuration will go away or won't be used for coexistence. So why does hybrid matter? Why do you actually need it? And what is the impact to users of either having hybrid in place or not? Users definitely will notice if you have an on-premises system and an organization being hosted in Exchange Online, and you attempt to actually collaborate between the two. Without hybrid in place, those two organizations are completely unrelated to each other. And so the experience that an end user would get when trying to collaborate with someone, say from on-premises to Exchange Online, would be the same experience they would have with trying to collaborate with a partner organization, another company that user communicates with on an ongoing basis, where no organizational relationship has been configured. So the contact or the recipient within Outlook would look like an internet email recipient. It wouldn't look like an internal recipient within your organization. You won't see any contact details. All you'll see is the name of the user that presumably has been manually entered, and the SMTP email address. Free busy information won't be available. So if you attempt to schedule a meeting in the scheduling assistant within Outlook and look for free busy information, it won't show up because there's no configured relationship, again, between that on-premises organization and Exchange Online. When you move to hybrid, you then get this rich collaboration experience that exists within Outlook and the full suite of client products that make up the Exchange ecosystem. And so from a free busy perspective, you'll certainly see that free busy information and be able to schedule meetings much more effectively. You'll get that rich information within the global address list. So you'll be able to see address information. You'll be able to see the organizational hierarchy, who that individual reports to, and be able to browse title information and everything else that shows up in that gal card. And additionally, within the recipient settings of a message, you'll actually get the visibility that you would normally get within an organization. So things like mail tips will work. The user will appear to be part of the same organization. From a migration perspective, you also get that sort of rich online mailbox move process that exists in recent on-premises versions of the Exchange product. And you can take advantage of that to very seamlessly move mailboxes up to Exchange Online within Office 365 without actually impacting the productivity of your users. So you can schedule mailbox moves, have that data synchronized in the background, And when the mailboxes are in sync between the on-premises system and Exchange Online, that final cutover process is very quick. Users generally don't even notice that, that it's happening, and the clients reconnect to the new location in Office 365. Users can get on with their job. Much, much easier than actually having to do another migration method that may involve significant downtime for end users. So FreeBusy will just work across the board. No need to recreate Outlook profiles, and this is actually a very important point because recreating an Outlook profile, particularly for cached mode users, means recreating the OST file, the cache of mailbox data, so you don't end up having to re-download all of those mailboxes. Users don't notice generally when these migrations happen. You get the global address list that shows all of the users on both sides of the organization, both in the cloud and on premises, and you get secure mail flow between the two organizations. There are also other features that we add on an ongoing basis to Office 365, many of which light up and take advantage of this hybrid connectivity between on-premises and the cloud. So the Exchange Hybrid Wizard, which is used to configure this organizational relationship between the on-premises system and Exchange Online, the wizard has quite a bit of history. And just to briefly go over it, we actually started out with a documented way to configure hybrid in Exchange 2010 SP1. And it was 72 pages of documentation, of which there were many, many places where an IT pro trying to implement this could make a mistake. And in general, any mistake would result in none of it working properly. So we found that very few people actually deployed hybrid. Extremely complex solution and very low adoption. So in 2010 SP2, we realized we needed to resolve that and created the first ever iteration of the Exchange Hybrid Configuration Wizard. Removed all the documentation and created an automated, very straightforward way to create this hybrid configuration. It's a tool that shipped with Exchange 2010 that could be used to automate this end to end. In Exchange 2013, we eliminated the standalone tool, moved to a web-based UI, made some changes around transport configuration, and again, from release to release, we're simplifying things, adding more functionality into the tool, and trying to make it easier to establish this relationship between the on-premises system and Exchange Online. In 2013 SP1, we added support for multiple on-premises Exchange organizations, which is a key thing that customers had been asking us for. In 2013 CU5, we added support for Gallatin, which is our sovereign cloud in the China region, as well as support for OAuth authentication. And then in Exchange 2013, CU10 and 2016, about the same time frame, we actually switched from having an Exchange Hybrid Wizard to having an Office 365 Hybrid Configuration Wizard. The idea here is a single platform that we can support across Office 365 and extend for additional workloads and other features that are outside of the traditional context of Exchange. We realized after that a very large number of our customers were actually still on Exchange 2010, had not moved forward to Exchange 2013 and 2016, and so we actually backported the Hybrid Configuration Wizard for Office 365 to work with Exchange 2010. Then we've recently added, as I mentioned, this option for full hybrid or minimal hybrid. And most recently added the concept of what we refer to as end-to-end onboarding. And that's really taking the idea that as you onboard to Office 365 and consider setting up hybrid as part of that, there are multiple steps that are involved in actually getting this configuration set up properly, getting directory sync running properly, getting all the endpoints configured, all of the documentation that needs to be run through and the checklists that need to be run through in order to make sure that you have a fully operational system in Exchange Online and Office 365 generally. We're actually using the Exchange Hybrid Wizard or the Office 365 Hybrid Configuration Wizard now as the sort of the primary tool to take you through that end-to-end process and ensure that when it's complete, you have a fully working solution across the board. We have moved to what we refer to as a web-based release. So we're no longer actually shipping a tool with the on-premises product that we release on the same schedule as that on-premises product, and instead have a tool that ships on the web that we can update very quickly based on customer feedback and our own view of telemetry that shows what types of errors or issues users are running into, and also provides great visibility into feedback from customers that are running this on an ongoing basis. So as an example, we ran into an issue shortly after moving to a web-based release that we'll quickly walk through here, where on a Monday, we had a new release of the hybrid configuration wizard pushed out to our users. And again, as you utilize the hybrid configuration wizard, you can take these updates very easily. So customers that are starting to run through the process on this Monday are seeing this new release. We did notice that a portion of customers who were running through the wizard started to see two interesting and unexpected errors. And the telemetry that we collect from the tool showed us that 33% of the failures that the users were experiencing with the hybrid configuration wizard were from these two errors that we really did not expect. These are errors that you would normally not get when running through the tool for legitimate reasons. So from the telemetry and from the feedback process that we have built into the tool, we actually have some logging information that's pushed up to us in a secure and privacy-aware way. So because we have those log files already available, we can investigate directly without anyone actually reaching out to us and complaining about the issues in the tool. So we investigated and found the cause still on Monday. This is still the day the new release was available to our users. On Monday, we actually addressed the flaw. We found the bug, we fixed the bug, checked in a fix, and verified that it was running properly. Tuesday, we have a new build being built and dropped internally for us to do some final validation on. And on Wednesday, it's actually pushed out live on the web. So that's 2 days later. And again, with that telemetry and with that feedback process, we can actually immediately see that we now have a 0% failure rate for these issues. Historically, this would have taken us months to actually address because the release cycle for those on-premises tools is aligned with the cumulative update process. So we're looking at months in between each release. This is a much, much quicker way for us to actually get new technology and fixed tools out to our users. So we're super happy about that. So let's spend a few minutes and go through some common questions that we typically get around hybrid configurations and reasons that customers often deploy a hybrid configuration. There are some common struggles that our customers face when onboarding to Exchange Online that hybrid configurations often can address well. One of them is certainly how to actually get those mailboxes into Exchange Online in a reasonable time frame. And by reasonable, there's multiple ways to look at that. Certainly you want to get there as quickly as possible, but at the same time, you don't want to impact the productivity of your end users. So there's certainly an option to take some downtime and migrate data as quickly as possible with everything offline. But again, that may not be the right choice for your end users with actually having that downtime in place and not allowing them to be productive and access their mailboxes. So moving to the cloud in a reasonable time frame also means ensuring that in addition to getting there quickly, that you're not causing unnecessary downtime. We also commonly hear concerns around dealing with the fast pace of the cloud. What I mean by that is the ongoing change, right? Because we're not shipping an on-premises product, in this case on a yearly cycle or a 3-year cycle, there's constant change happening in Office 365 and Exchange Online. There's new features being introduced. There are small changes being made to the user interface of the products in order to respond to user feedback and ensure that we're continuing to add value to our products. That also means that that on that very quick cycle, your end users are experiencing these new features, and you're having to respond to that quickly. Also, we commonly hear concerns around dealing with split experiences. So there's features and functionality in the on-premises version of our products, and then there's additional features and functionality in the cloud that doesn't necessarily light up in those on-premises products. So being able to have a story around how you're going to ensure that the right users within your organization get access to that great new functionality in the cloud without impacting your business, that's something hybrid can help with. And then we also hear concerns around how to reorg the IT department in moving to Office 365 around the different technologies that are necessary to support usage of Office 365 and Exchange Online. The process of establishing hybrid can kind of help with thinking through that when we talk about a messaging group that is often responsible for Exchange and an identity team that's often responsible for Active Directory on premises and is likely going to be managing directory sync and moving to the cloud. We also have to be concerned about where data will actually be stored. There's multiple ways to think about this as well. There's technical limitations when we think about where users are actually located. An example of this would be a multinational company that has offices in Europe, offices in North America, offices in Asia. The Exchange Online tenant for that user is likely going to be in a single region. We'll talk in a few minutes about some new options that are available to actually spread out that tenant across multiple regions. But today, that tenant is going to be in one region. Providing high-performance access to that tenant for users outside of the region can be challenging, particularly when there are bandwidth issues or latency issues with the connectivity in those specific locations. Maintaining some sort of on-premises deployment in those other regions may be a legitimate way to solve those concerns, and certainly establishing hybrid becomes kind of a necessity to allow for close collaboration and that one organization experience. There's also legal implications. Certainly we hear on an ongoing basis that our customers have concerns about where regionally their data actually sits. There's certainly regulatory requirements in certain regions for certain types of industries where data must exist in the location of the company or the subsidiary. And maintaining mailboxes on premises is certainly, again, a legitimate way to respond to that. And as I mentioned, the fast pace of change certainly causes you to have to think about what features will be made available to your users, what sort of roadmap there is for those features, when things are going to light up. Microsoft typically defaults to turning new features on for all users. And so that means that when those features light up, you need to be ready to respond. There are some organizations that choose to leave mailboxes on premises to have a little more control over when users will actually get exposed to the new functionality that shows up in Exchange Online and Office 365. We certainly hope that, in general, mailboxes are relocated or migrated, onboarded to Office 365 so that users can actually take advantage of these new features. But if there are scenarios where some of these things don't make sense for a given portion of users within an organization, leaving some of those mailboxes on-prem may make sense. One common area of pushback that we frequently hear when moving to Office 365 Exchange Online is from folks in the security group within an IT organization. So the Chief Information Security Officer or someone within that group will often push back and comment that Office 365 in general or hybrid Exchange is not really a secure solution, and you need to do a bunch of work to figure out how to properly secure it. It's important to understand that it actually is a secure solution from Microsoft's perspective, and we spend quite a bit of time documenting why we believe it's secure and why you can trust us. It's highly worth taking a look at the Microsoft Exchange team blog on how hybrid authentication really works. Historically, we've gotten some feedback that these inbound requests that come into your on-premises organization from Office 365 for things like FreeBusy lookups, the MRS requests that are used to migrate content into Exchange Online, that these types of requests that are initiated by Office 365 coming into your on-premises deployment are not secure. The primary reason that people believe that is because the authentication methods are a little bit different than what you're used to traditionally. This blog article that I'm referring to actually goes into a great level of detail about how the authentication process works, how the organizational trusts work, and why you can actually rely on that authentication process to secure your on-premises deployment and keep your information secure and private within your organization. Additionally, the Office 365 Trust Center goes into even more detail on how Microsoft secures our solutions end-to-end, both in terms of physical security of our data centers, as well as software-level security of how we actually ensure that you are in control of your information and in control of your tenant and your tenant's configuration. So highly worth taking a look at that and using that as a resource with your security team so that you can gain that level of trust and feel comfortable moving forward. Oftentimes, security groups will say, yes, it's okay to deploy hybrid, but you can't publish OA, AutoDiscover, ActiveSync, et cetera, on the internet. Well, you do need to publish some endpoints on the internet or in a location that Office 365 can reach out to in order to actually maintain this rich coexistence or this collaboration between the on-premises organization and Exchange Online. There are ways to do this where you're mitigating the risk of actually exposing those endpoints to Office 365. One of those is to use Office 365 IP filtering. We do publish a very detailed set of IP addresses that are used for the Office 365 services. So you can see from those lists that we publish where all the inbound requests that are specifically from Microsoft will be coming from. You can then limit on your firewalls, proxies, whatever infrastructure you have facing the internet or facing Office 365, you can limit requests to originate from those IP addresses and mitigate risk that way. You can also consider using the Azure App Proxies tool. Azure App Proxy basically takes what would traditionally be an on-premises endpoint and moves the endpoint into the Azure cloud. And then you can have Office 365 reach out to that Azure App Proxy endpoint instead of actually exposing an endpoint on your internet edge. We also frequently hear that security groups want to inspect everything running on the network to and from Exchange Online. And this typically is related to a traditional method of managing internet connectivity, where the internet isn't trusted from a network perspective or from a security perspective, which makes perfect sense. You never know what you're going to encounter on the internet. And so as a result, security teams will typically deploy proxies and sometimes even inspection devices that will break SSL and actually look at the traffic at a low level to understand what is actually traveling across the network in both directions. With Exchange Online, this traffic is going to be encrypted. So inspecting that will require actually breaking that SSL encryption. And in general, we highly recommend not breaking that SSL encryption, not doing SSL break and inspect for traffic originating on premises and going to Office 365. For that traffic coming inbound, typically you would publish those endpoints in the same way that you would have with an on-premises deployment where you had mobile users accessing the system via the internet. So you'll often have a load balancer on the edge or a reverse proxy. Oftentimes those are actually terminating SSL and then reestablishing an SSL connection to that internal resource. Generally, that's a perfectly legitimate way to publish these endpoints to Office 365. Just be aware that SSL offloading is not an option for a portion of the hybrid workloads or a portion of that hybrid traffic. So in general, if you are going to break SSL at the edge, plan to reestablish it between the edge of the network, the edge of the internet, and the internal resources. It's also important to understand that secure is up to interpretation. So in general, we believe that publishing Exchange on the internet is a very easy thing to do securely today. In fact, we published some articles on the Exchange team blog years ago that were advocating for the idea that reverse proxies were no longer necessary. That just having a firewall on the edge of the internet and then you'll typically have a load balancer on the other side of the firewall that's managing that connectivity between the internet and your internal resources. That really is enough, as long as you have the right processes in place to manage malware scanning and manage security patching on those Windows servers that are hosting the Exchange endpoints. Important to understand that there is a difference between mailbox moves and other coexistence traffic. So mailbox move traffic is using the MRS service, the mailbox replication service, and that's going to involve inbound requests from Office 365 into your on-premises deployment. And you're going to define what that migration endpoint is that Office 365 will use. You can actually create multiple migration endpoints. So you could be you could have migration endpoints that are used for a segment of the moves that you're running that have different credentials. If that helps with the security and risk conversation, some customers actually go to the length of having migration endpoints that are added and removed on an ongoing basis with different credentials to try and mitigate the risk of having those credentials leak or be discovered in some way. Certainly, as I mentioned, you can maintain IP-based ACLs, so you can lock down this traffic to only originate from Office 365. Important to understand that if you do decide to do that, be very aware of the documentation that we have around what those IP addresses look like and how often they change. They typically change on a monthly basis, and there is an RSS feed available so that you can be aware of what those changes look like and proactively update the ACLs on your firewalls and reverse proxies. So as I mentioned previously, the MRS proxy traffic in particular, and this is generally going to be true, or generally going to be a recommendation for all of our traffic. MRS proxy traffic has to be passed through. You cannot offload SSL. So if you do terminate SSL at the edge on a load balancer or a proxy device, you need to reestablish SSL between whatever that device is and the Exchange role that's going to be targeted by that traffic. In general, we also recommend not utilizing network threat detection solutions, whatever that may be as a generic category for this traffic. So we want to have this traffic flow be as simple as possible. And in an ideal world, edge of the network would be a firewall. You'd have a load balancer on the other side of the firewall, and then you'd have Exchange sitting on the other side of the load balancer. That's the best practice. The more complexity that you add, the more latency you add, the more opportunity for things to try to help, but more frequently actually break that communication process and cause issues. The hybrid configuration wizard is actually designed to be able to rerun on an ongoing basis. So it's designed such that it will detect the configuration in Exchange Online and will detect the configuration in the on-premises deployment and figure out what needs to be changed, what needs to be updated to bring those settings up to date and ensure that everything is configured properly for the hybrid organization. So there are cases where you absolutely do need to rerun the hybrid configuration wizard. When you update or modify transport certificates, we need to update that secure mail flow process. So that's a case where the hybrid configuration wizard will help and update things properly on both sides of the organization to make sure that secure mail flow will continue to work properly. When you add or remove accepted domains, that's also another example where we need to configure things properly on both sides. Hybrid configuration wizard can do that in an automated way for you. Additionally, again, related to the secure mail configuration, if you add or remove servers that are going to participate in that secure mail flow process on the on-premises side of your organization, that's another case where rewriting the HCW is important. And then this last case that we call out when Microsoft says to, there certainly are features, new functionality that we add into Exchange Online that lights up with a hybrid configuration. And some of those cases may involve actually adding new Active Directory attributes or things that are set within the hybrid configuration wizard. Those would be cases where we would advise rerunning the latest version of the HCW so that the on-premises organization and the Exchange Online tenant are properly updated to take advantage of those new features. When you update Exchange on premises, you do not need to run the hybrid configuration wizard, and you certainly don't need to rerun it when you're making changes to the organization that are just very specific to the on-premises side of things. So adding a DAG, if you're adding Mailbox servers and moving them into a new DAG, or even just adding new Mailbox servers in an existing database availability group, there's no need to make Office 365 or Exchange Online aware of that change. That's isolated to your own on-premises deployment, and so there's no reason in those types of cases to rerun the hybrid configuration wizard. Additionally, client access settings, those are going to be discovered via the auto-discover process when Office 365 reaches out to your organization. So you don't need to rerun the HCW when you do that, because we'll discover those dynamically via auto-discover. So when thinking about moving to Exchange Online, if you have older versions of Exchange on premises, we often hear the question, do I need to upgrade hybrid servers to the latest version? So let's say hypothetically you have Exchange 2010 or 2013 on premises. Now, obviously, we want to make sure that you're running a supported version of Exchange on premises. That's key. So make sure that you understand what that support lifecycle looks like for whatever version you're running on premises. But if you do have a supported version, then we need to think through whether or not it's actually required for you or makes sense for you to update servers that are going to be used for this hybrid communications process. So if you have Exchange 2010 or 2013, first question, are you happy? Are you satisfied with that deployment? If you're happy, stay there. Simple as that. If you're not happy, then we need to talk about why. So do you have issues that are unrelated to the Exchange hybrid process, just an unhealthy deployment of Exchange in general? Well, if so, you really need to fix those first, right? Don't start with an unhealthy organization that has issues that you don't understand showing up in the event log, or problems occurring on an ongoing basis where servers are failing. You really need to have a healthy organization so that if you run into problems through this deployment process, you understand where those problems are and that they're actually specifically related to the changes that you're making when establishing hybrid. That'll make it far easier to troubleshoot and resolve those issues. If you start with an unhealthy deployment, you'll really have no idea how to properly troubleshoot. It'll be a much lengthier process to actually get healthy after you've gone hybrid. So if you have issues that are related to establishing this hybrid connectivity, fix those issues, and then decide again, are you happy with the deployment? Realize that upgrade is absolutely a last resort. We don't want you to have to upgrade just in order to establish hybrid connectivity. So if you do need to upgrade, what's the purpose? We're talking about long-term coexistence. In other words, you're going to do full hybrid. You're planning on actually having mailboxes on premises and in the cloud on an ongoing basis, potentially forever, right? If that's the case, move mailboxes first. In other words, go ahead and establish that hybrid connectivity and get that mailbox migration process done. Once it's done and you're happy with where the mailboxes are located, everything's working well, then at that point you can upgrade those hybrid servers or those servers that are used to maintain this connectivity between Office 365 and your on-premises deployment to 2013 or 2016. Again, get those mailboxes up there, get your users to a happy place, taking advantage of the functionality that's available as part of Office 365, and then at your leisure, go ahead and upgrade those servers to manage whatever the issue was that's requiring the upgrade. If you're going to do a full migration, again, go ahead and move the mailboxes. Just get the mailboxes up there. There's really no reason to move to the latest version of Exchange for this hybrid connectivity, just to manage this move mailboxes process. Now, if there is a cross-premises feature that requires the latest version or a specific version of Exchange on premises to be present, to facilitate that cross-organization communication process, then absolutely it makes sense to go ahead and do that upgrade up front. So we often get this question of, should I go ahead and move forward with installing a 2013 or a 2016 server? Important to understand that all of this connectivity from Office 365 is actually going to be coming into your organization in the same way that the external users or the mobile users, the home users of your organization are accessing your on-premises deployment today. So they'll come in via that internet edge, and we'll use that same endpoint publishing for coexistence, for FreeBSD requests and for those MRS requests. If you deploy a 2013 or a 2016 server, it basically sits in front of that Exchange 2010 organization or that legacy Exchange organization, and will expose those updated endpoints to Office 365 as well as those external users. And then for the outbound requests from your on-premises organization for things like FreeBSD lookups, you'll actually be communicating from the legacy servers on premises up to Office 365. Placing that Exchange 2013 or 2016 server in front of the legacy system is essentially adding those updated endpoints, but not requiring you to update the entire Exchange organization and move everything to the updated version. So when we talk about deploying that newer version of Exchange on premises in order to potentially take advantage of features that require it, in general, we're just talking about that, we'll call it a hybrid role server. Again, there isn't really truly a hybrid role for Exchange. It's that Exchange client access role, or in newer releases of the product, it's the Mailbox role because there really is only one role. But it's that server that's just taking those inbound requests from the internet and from Office 365 and ensuring that it's doing the right thing with them. Again, not upgrading the entire back-end infrastructure on premises. From a sizing perspective, in general, this is not something you need to worry about, right? Looking visually at the slide, oftentimes when we go through a sizing conversation with customers for hybrid, we look at what they have, and there's an assumption that we're deploying something extremely complex in order to make this hybrid communications process work. There's going to be all of these inbound requests from Office 365 coming on premises, and we'll have to make sure that we've actually sized properly. So we need this huge number of Exchange servers that are just dedicated to the process of listening for these requests. In reality, it's not true. If you have a properly sized Exchange deployment, you're not going to materially impact the number of requests that you're actually receiving into that Exchange deployment by establishing hybrid. And so what you have today is typically exactly what you need. Now again, you clearly need to monitor your system, make sure you're not overloaded, just as you would with a fully on-premises deployment today. So if you do run into problems, you can respond quickly and add some additional capacity. But in general, from a planning perspective, what you have today is what you need. So let's talk about a few common mistakes or issues that people run into when establishing hybrid. So we often get some feedback that it's confusing. Why when I establish hybrid communications and then I migrate all my mailboxes to Exchange Online, do I have to keep Exchange on premises? It really has nothing to do with Exchange. The issue that causes us to have to keep some Exchange resources on-prem actually comes down to directory management and directory synchronization. So when you establish a directory synchronization relationship with Office 365, what you're essentially saying is the master for that information is going to remain on premises. So when I update attributes on my directory objects, I need to do that on premises. A good example of this would be things like adding proxy addresses or changing the domains associated with my recipients. I need to do that on premises and have those changes synchronize up to Office 365 because the source of truth for those users is actually the on-premises deployment. I can't make those changes in Office 365 and have them synchronized down to my on-premises deployment. The implication there is that you need a supported way of updating those Exchange-related directory properties on premises. And the only supported way to do that is via Exchange tools, such as PowerShell or the Exchange Admin Center. That means, obviously, you need to actually have those Exchange tools deployed, and that means keeping some Exchange infrastructure on premises on an ongoing basis. This starts to feel a little bit ridiculous when you talk about doing something like migrating from Notes into Office 365 Exchange Online. And in order to manage those Exchange-related properties, even though you didn't have Exchange to begin with on premises, if you are utilizing directory sync, which you might be using just because you want federated identity with ADFS or some other federated identity provider. You actually have to have a very minimal deployment of Exchange on premises in order to be able to properly update those directory attributes. So the key thing here to remember is that if you truly want to get rid of on-premises Exchange, you can't be using ADFS, you can't be using password sync, you can't be using any of these features that rely on directory synchronization between the on-premises deployment and Office 365. We absolutely understand that that is a concern and something that is a pain point for many of our customers. There's a desire to fully migrate to Exchange Online and eliminate the need for this on-premises infrastructure. And we are working very hard on addressing this. We've got some great solutions in mind, so stay tuned. We'll get there as soon as we possibly can. But for now, this is the situation that we're in. So are there any other reasons to keep Exchange around? If you've migrated all of your mailboxes to Exchange Online, other reasons beyond that directory sync issue that I mentioned, that recipient management issue. Well, we often hear feedback that customers want a little bit of a risk mitigation strategy with their cloud migration. If you keep Exchange around, you can actually very easily move mailboxes back on premises if it's necessary. If you run into issues with features, functionality, availability, whatever the issue is that you have a concern with, just as you can do that online mailbox move from on-premises into Exchange Online, you can also go the opposite direction and offboard a mailbox in a very straightforward way. SMTP relay is another common reason for this. So if you have devices like scanners or multifunction copier scanner type devices that have the ability to generate email, those often don't have a lot of functionality in terms of authentication to SMTP targets and may not be able to directly communicate with Exchange Online. If that's the case, having that local SMTP endpoint that those devices can communicate with and then relay that traffic to Exchange Online, or even for line of business applications that you might have that generate email, this is another great reason to keep some Exchange infrastructure on premises. Use that as the endpoint for relaying that mail up to your actual user mailboxes in Exchange Online. Third-party software that integrates with Exchange may not be able to directly integrate with Exchange Online. Certainly, worth spending some time figuring out for any of these third-party products that integrate with your messaging system, whether or not they can communicate with the API endpoints that are available in Exchange Online. And if not, you may need to maintain that on-premises infrastructure as that sort of integration endpoint. Then we do have some limitations on scalability when it comes to public folders in Exchange Online. And if you run into any of those scalability limitations, this is certainly another case where leaving public folders on-prem with that legacy Exchange infrastructure may be a perfectly legitimate use case for long-term hybrid coexistence. Cross-premises permissions are another common concern that we run into. So this is a kind of a common scenario that we hear complaints about. So hypothetically, we have a user named Sophie here who just had her mailbox moved to Office 365. She's super happy that she can get all this new functionality that didn't exist in the legacy version of the Exchange on-premises product that her company had deployed. Mike, the IT guy that manages messaging for the organization, also super happy that he's got the first batch of mailboxes in the company migrated to Office 365. So he's getting ready to take a vacation and relax for a little while. However, Sophie notices fairly quickly that her assistant all of a sudden can't actually get to her calendar. There's a delegate relationship established here. So she reaches out to Mike and asks him what happened. Any of you who have been around Exchange for a while and have dealt with cross-premises permissions and delegate scenarios and these types of issues probably have a fairly good idea of what went wrong here. So Mike started looking into the problem and realized that delegate permissions weren't supported in a hybrid environment. He wasn't ready for that. In the past, we've always said that if you have anyone with a delegate relationship or any of these permissions established, you needed to move them at the same time. So there wasn't actually a cross-premises issue when it came to accessing data in mailboxes. Well, let's talk about the reality today, because we've actually done quite a bit of work to try and resolve these issues in the latest releases of the Hybrid Configuration Wizard, the on-premises product, and Exchange Online. So if you have an on-premises mailbox communicating with a cloud mailbox, and it's a full access type of permission relationship, that will absolutely work as expected. Permissions can be migrated as the mailbox moves. The cloud mailbox today was migrated from on-prem up to Office 365. We migrate those permissions, and permissions can be assigned cross-premises as well for full access. If the cloud side just has send as permissions, migrated permissions will work. Again, they have to be assigned on premises. You cannot assign cross-premises send as permissions. So if assigned on premises and then migrated, they'll continue to work properly. Same thing for send on behalf. Migrated permissions will work if assigned on-prem, and then the mailbox is moved after. You cannot define send on behalf permissions cross-premises. So after the move, you can't change. If we're talking about cloud to cloud, obviously both mailboxes are in the same environment, so not cross-premises. Cloud to cloud from a send as permission perspective, again, works as expected if they're both in the same environment. If you do offboard, in other words, move one of the mailboxes from cloud back to on-premises, permissions stop working. We don't actually migrate permissions in that direction. And the same would be true for send on behalf. So moving from on-premises up to cloud, we will migrate these permissions. They will continue to work. Be aware that for send as and send on behalf, once the mailbox is migrated, you can't add or change those permissions for associated on-prem mailboxes. So ideally, you want to eventually get all those mailboxes with these relationships into the cloud. But for the scenario where you're slowly but surely migrating users into Office 365, we think we're in a much better state today in terms of being able to support these cross-premises permission scenarios. So let's talk a little bit about the hybrid mesh, or the hybrid mess, as some people like to call it. So the example here is that we have two companies, Company A and Company B. Both of them have on-premises deployments. And Company B also has a tenant in Office 365, Exchange Online. So we have a user in Company A, we'll call her Brianna, and she's going to request FreeBusy information for Timothy in Company B. And so Exchange finds that Timothy is an external user, and there is an organizational relationship already established for Timothy's domain. So Company A and Company B have an organizational relationship established between each other. This could be something that has been around for years. These two companies collaborate, and they have this relationship established. So Exchange in Company A will go to the Microsoft Federation Gateway and request a delegation token, basically a token that will be used for authentication and authorization to get some FreeBusy information from Company B's servers. So the Federation Gateway returns a token, and via autodiscover, Brianna's Exchange implementation in Company A will now go and figure out how to get to Timothy's on-premises deployment in Company B using that delegation token. So at this point, the Exchange infrastructure in Company B realizes that the mailbox for Timothy is actually in Office 365. So we have a little bit of a problem now. So we respond back with information in the autodiscover response that provides a hint that based on the target address in the directory in Company B, that the place we need to go is actually Office 365. So from here, basically things break. So the answer that the Exchange server gets in Company A is, you can think of it as a referral to go talk to Office 365, but in this particular case, Company A doesn't have any sort of organizational relationship established with that organization in Office 365 for Company B. So nothing can happen from this point forward, and Brianna and her scheduling assistant within Outlook won't actually be able to see FreeBusy information. So understand, trusts are not transitive. Just because Company B has an Office 365 tenant and has established hybrid connectivity so that users within Company B can see FreeBusy information for each other, that doesn't mean that the trust that's configured between the on-premises deployments for Company A and B will apply to that Office 365 tenant for company B. So how do you resolve this? One way to resolve it is to actually implement GalSync and have directory synchronization between those organizations so that the directory in Company A actually understands where the mailboxes are for Company B and can reach out to the appropriate location, whether it's the on-premises deployment for Company B or Office 365. From there, you also actually need to have organizational relationships and inter-organization connectors between every environment. So Company A would have to have a relationship established between both the on-premises implementation for Company B as well as Company B's Office 365 tenant. That's why this becomes the hybrid mesh or mess, depending on how you want to look at it. We often hear some questions around mailbox provisioning. So you have a hybrid deployment established, a hybrid relationship set up between on-premises and Office 365. How do you create new mailboxes? Well, you can do it via the new remote mailboxes commandlet, and that will directly create a mailbox in Office 365. Important to understand, though, that when you do that, Office 365 or Exchange Online is going to go stamp those Exchange GUIDs or those IDs that are associated with the mailbox in Office 365. And because we use the on-premises directory as the source of truth, we don't actually write those identifiers back to the on-premises directory. Well, we need those identifiers to be present on premises if we're ever going to move that mailbox back to on-premises. So, in general, the best way to do this is actually to create a new mailbox on premises, just an empty mailbox, and then migrate the empty mailbox to Office 365 if that's where you want it to be. So it's kind of a workaround or a hack, but it's something that can be helpful if you do want the ability to offboard those mailboxes or move them back on premises on demand. Also, really important to understand that before you move forward with actually establishing hybrid connectivity, we talked about making sure that the system was healthy. One aspect of that system health is network connectivity and infrastructure. Oftentimes, people don't think about network as something they need to pay attention to when they're onboarding to Office 365. The on-premises network works great. All of your internal connectivity works fine, and maybe your outbound connectivity to the internet through your proxy server on the edge works great. But migrating to Office 365 means that you're now going to have significantly more connections going outbound through that connection to Microsoft infrastructure. And you're also, as part of this hybrid relationship, going to have inbound connections coming in that you didn't have before. So proxy servers are a concern, ensuring that you scale those properly to support all those outbound connections, and understanding how to properly configure your firewalls and any sort of additional security infrastructure that you have on the edge of your network to support those inbound connections, extremely important. There's a couple of links on the slide, one of them to the list of IPs that we use for the service within Microsoft's data centers. I talked earlier about how that can be used to update firewalls and devices on the edge of the network to either limit traffic to just Office 365 inbound connections or to ensure that you're allowing connections to Microsoft infrastructure outbound from your organization. Important to understand what those IPs are and how to keep those up to date as they change on an ongoing basis. Additionally, we have some guidance at aka.ms/tune that goes through bandwidth planning, understanding what the impact will be as you move users to Office 365 and how to properly plan and tune that connectivity. With Exchange 2010 or later, we do have the ability to support hybrid deployment of multiple organizations. So the example on screen, we have two Exchange organizations on premises, separate forests, separate AD forests, one for Contoso.com and one for Fabricam.com. And we have Office 365 on screen as well at the top. So the desire here is to establish hybrid connectivity that actually takes into account both of the on-premises organizations and establishes that hybrid relationship with an Office 365 tenant where we can collaborate and migrate mailboxes. So how do we do this? How does this work? Well, first of all, we need a two-way forest trust between the two on-premises forests so that we can properly authenticate and communicate and collaborate between those two organizations. We need to make sure that we have supported versions of Exchange in place. We need to make sure that all the basics are properly configured. So auto-discover needs to work, right? We need to be able to properly discover endpoints in both of those organizations in order to be able to communicate and collaborate properly. We need to have certificates configured properly, and this means we need unique public certificates. So we can't have a single certificate that has multiple names on it that support both of the organizations. Each organization needs a unique public certificate. We need to configure mail flow. So we need to make sure before we go and establish hybrid connectivity that the two on-premises organizations can actually communicate from a mail flow perspective. So we'll set up the SMTP domains and we'll make sure that that works properly. From there, we configure directory sync. The AAD Connect tool can be used to actually source information from both of the on-premises forests, and that's fairly straightforward to configure in recent versions of AAD Connect, which is the tool that replaced DirSync. So that will take directory information from both of the forests and synchronize it into Azure Active Directory within that single Azure Active Directory tenant. And then we run the hybrid configuration wizard, and we'll have to do that in both locations. We'll have to do it in the contoso.com forest and the fabricam.com forest. And that'll go establish all the organizational relationships and the trusts and everything that are necessary for both of the on-premises organizations to trust and communicate with the Office 365 tenant. Once that's done, we should actually have mail flow working in a secure way between all of the different organizations that make up this diagram. And then if we want to, we can then configure ADFS at this point if we want to use federated identity or some other third-party federated identity solution. And if we did that, we would need to configure ADFS in both of the on-premises organizations, get those proxies configured so that we have an externally facing endpoint that Office 365 can reach and validate that works properly. Then we need to configure org relationships between each organization. And so that involves the two on-premises organizations, since we'll be establishing the hybrid organization relationship with Office 365 as part of the hybrid configuration wizard. So requirements to make this work. Each Exchange org has to have at least one distinct SMTP namespace. We have to have a way to figure out where a user exists and how to properly route mail between those organizations. And so we need a distinct SMTP namespace for each organization. Again, if you've dealt with Exchange cross-premises, cross-organization type migrations or communication in the past, there's nothing new here, right? We've always needed a distinct SMTP namespace for each one of them. I mentioned we need different public certificates. We're not reusing a certificate for each environment that has multiple names on it. We need a different public certificate for each one of these. If we're using shared domains, then we need mail routing and auto-discover set up first and working properly before we begin at all, establishing the end-to-end communications. Office 365 has to be able to reach the auto-discover endpoints for each organization. Again, we use that as part of the hybrid communication process or the collaboration process to discover those externally facing endpoints that are used to provide that hybrid functionality. This is possible with Exchange 2010, 2013, and 2016. Have to use the latest version of the HCW, but again, with the web release and the fact that we're always taking the current version when we run the HCW, that shouldn't be an issue. And from a trust perspective, important to understand, as mentioned previously, these trusts from an organizational relationship perspective are not transitive. You do need that on-premises org trust to be configured manually because we don't do that as part of the hybrid configuration wizard. We do not support hybrid configurations where you have multiple tenants in Office 365. You need to have for the same set of users, essentially, for the same directory. You need to have a single tenant that you're using in Office 365, and that can be associated with multiple forests on premises. That's the thing to understand here. We can't go multi-forest on-prem to multiple tenants in Office 365. We do have a role within the Exchange on-premises product called the Edge role. It's a transport-specific role, and it's used in the case where you want to have transport sitting in the edge of your network in a way that is not joined to Active Directory and works very well in a DMZ. So this handles the scenario where there's a specific security requirement in place that all of your inbound connections have to be terminated in the DMZ and can't actually reach into the inside of your network where Active Directory and the other Exchange infrastructure sits. Edge can absolutely be used with hybrid, and we'll certainly be aware of the Edge infrastructure when the hybrid configuration wizard runs and configure things properly as a result. Edge is not required, but if it's there, we'll use it. So if there's a requirement from a security perspective to have it in place, we'll take advantage of it. But when going into a hybrid configuration, there's no specific requirement to deploy new Edge roles to make that work. Sizing Edge servers for hybrid environments is actually a fairly difficult thing to do because we have no sizing guidance published for Edge in general today. The best way to think about sizing Edge is that Edge consists of the same transport components that make up the other more traditional Exchange roles. And so sizing those Edge servers in the same way is generally appropriate. Look at the guidance that we have published for Exchange Mailbox servers around the message throughput rates that you can get with those servers, and size Edge accordingly. Additionally, the obvious guidance of starting small and monitoring the system and then scaling up as needed also would apply here. So if you have the ability to start small, keep an eye on those servers, and then figure out what your capacity needs are, that's also a great way to do this. So with that, thank you for your time. Appreciate your attention to this topic, and I hope that this will help produce some successful and easy hybrid deployments with Exchange Online.